As we come to the end of the industrial imperial era, let's pick up where we left off. By the early 1900s, a German nation had united and formed a new, strong state, Germany, right in the middle of Europe. The Italian nation, likewise, had united and formed a state, Italy. Russia was still basically in the Middle Ages with a feudal system and aristocracy, lack of industrialization, but also a ton of land and a giant army. Britain was busy building her empire and her navy. Austria-Hungary, a multi-ethnic land empire, was held together by a shaky emperor who had just lost some land to Prussia, but wasn't too bitter about it. France, however, was very bitter about having lost land to the newly formed state, Germany, which has a huge army and was right next door, making France very nervous. All of these states were competing for colonies, competing to have the largest military, and were increasingly becoming nationalist about all of that. The story we tell today is going to connect the dots between this situation in the late 19th century and World War I, which we're going to start to cover in the next unit. And it's connecting those dots by fleshing out the implications of imperialism. We've seen that as capitalist industrial nations competed for the largest economy, they increasingly saw it necessary to conquer or dominate different parts of the world, to extract raw materials, make goods out of them, and then use those same places for markets for finished goods. The competition for empire involved another piece of the puzzle, because you can't just go around claiming different parts of the world without having a big enough army to back it up. And the thing about having a big enough army is it's only big enough if it's as big or bigger than the next strongest state. So competition for the strongest industrial economy and the largest empire also involved competition for larger and larger military capabilities, and along with that, a growing comfort with using the military to solve diplomatic problems. So today's lesson is going to be then on those two last pieces of the puzzle that gets us from the imperial era to World War I, militarism and great power competition. And we're going to start with a quote by historian A.J.P. Taylor, who, if you love reading history, he's hilarious. I recommend his work highly. This quote isn't hilarious, it's just like on point. He writes, "Though the object of being a great power is to be able to fight a great war, the only way of remaining a great power is not to fight one." In other words, to count as a great power of Europe, states had to have the capability of fighting each other in a big, long, drawn-out conflict. But that big, long, drawn-out conflict saps the power of all the states, creating something of a paradox. So that's the story we're getting to. Today we're going to see the mindsets that kind of created it through looking at the scramble for Africa. First, what makes a great power? To count as a great power, a state had to have an industrial economy, a large military, an empire, or some combination thereof. Throughout the late 1800s and early 1900s, we saw different European states compete not just for larger and larger industrial capabilities, but along with that, larger and larger military capabilities. So that tends to correlate with industrialization, except in the case of Russia, which had a large military capability just because it was big. We tend to look at overseas colonies for indications that a place has an empire, but Russia we really need to focus on as an exception because it was gigantic And you could see it as a land empire because it conquered that giant piece of land slowly over the centuries. So we had, for our great powers of Europe, many industrial states that had conquered colonies overseas, including France, Germany at the very beginnings of this process, Great Britain having conquered lots of stuff, the United States starting to, Italy starting to. And then we had big states like Russia that had not industrialized yet, but they had a huge population. And from that huge population, you get the ability to keep a huge standing army, which qualified it as a great power, even though it looks like it doesn't have an overseas empire, and even though it had not industrialized like these other states. Militarism is the habit of mind that encourages states and diplomats to solve their problems using the military and to prioritize growing their military over time. And here you can see some indication of that. There was the naval race. So a dreadnought is a ship that is useful in naval warfare, right? Britain initially had the most, and you can see as Germany forms and really settles into industrialization, Germany begins to compete with Britain to have the most ships. Britain can't have that because that's the source of her strength. So of course she continues to make more, thus creating kind of a vicious cycle. This was also the age, tragically, of the machine gun, and there was no greater symbol of this militaristic trend than the Maxim machine gun, which was the first recoil-operated machine gun invented by an American-born British inventor, Sir Hiram Maxim, in 1884. It has been called the weapon most associated with British imperial conquest because having this machine gun allowed British colonizers to conquer huge swaths of land in Africa, for example, when they were up against opponents that did not have this kind of technology. The machine gun was so new and so important to imperial conquest that it even showed up in the poetry of the time, such as the work The Modern Traveler from 1898, which ends with the lines, "Whatever happens, we have got the Maxim machine gun, and they have not." In other words, the Maxim machine gun gave the people who wielded it a tremendous, almost insurmountable advantage over any enemy who didn't have it. The story we're about to start to tell in the next unit, however, is a story of World War I, which was a war of industrially equipped states against other industrially equipped states, both of which had the machine gun. If you look at the machine gun, try to picture how hard it would be to advance, to gain any ground in a war where both sides are firing these at each other at the same time. If you can picture that, it's horrible, and you have a pretty good idea of why World War I itself was horrible too. At this point, you can pause the slide and take notes on great power competition and militarism, but then press play again because we're not done. Industrial states linked having colonies to power and wealth, and so they competed for colonies to increase their power and wealth. And increasingly nationalism, this idea that your nation is superior to others and you should take pride in it, became increasingly bound up in this idea of a powerful superior state. So, imperial conquests fueled nationalism. Imperial competition and nationalism meant that the great powers needed to have increasingly large military capabilities to keep and conquer other nations and to remain competitive against the other Western powers. Meanwhile, the age of industrial warfare becomes possible. Industrialization allowed Western states, especially, to mass produce more and more weapons, like the machine gun, for example. Competition was particularly intense among the great powers of Europe, but also the United States and Japan, all industrialized states. The great powers can be thought of as strong states in Europe that kind of balance each other's power out, namely England, France, Germany, Russia, and on the decline, but still counting technically, Austria-Hungary. By the close of the 19th century, industrialization made Europeans the leaders in the ability to make war. Mass-produced new weapons, especially the machine gun, rendered the mass charge suicidal, meaning you couldn't just rush at the enemy line anymore because the machine gun would obliterate any attempt to do that. Meanwhile, railroads and steamships gave Europeans greater mobility. Given their spectacular success in applying these advantages to imperialize most of the globe, Europeans became more and more comfortable with the idea of using the military to solve political problems, and this is called militarism. Militarism is the belief that having a strong military is super important, and being ready to use it aggressively to defend or promote national interests is good. Eventually, the system of competition for power between the great powers of Europe and the industrial capacity to mass-produce weapons of increasing lethality would lead to one of the most devastating wars in history, the First World War, also known as World War I, also known as the Great War. So pause here, take notes, then press play again. To recap, we're heading into a danger zone. Nationalism, which causes conflict that regular people tend to feel really, really strongly about, like the kinds of people who tend to join the army, is on the rise. We have two new states who are behind on the colony grab. Most of the world has already been divided, and Germany and Italy are late. And they are eager to prove themselves. One of them, Germany, is led by a particularly insecure Kaiser, and insecure leaders make horrific decisions often. European states are each competing to have the biggest militaries with the most industrially produced weapons. And each of them have specific reasons to mistrust the others. And each of them have a different advantage over the others, and these advantages kind of cancel each other out. So, were they to get into a war, they would be pretty evenly matched, and that means there's no quick victory for anyone, probably. They're also kind of aggressive, and they're pretty quick to be like, okay, fine, war then. It's called militarism. And the competition for colonies means that there are several conflicts into the story already. In other words, they have several reasons already to be suspicious of one another. Let's look at how the colonization from Africa, called the Scramble for Africa, kind of exacerbated these conflicts and these trends with a story from our old favorite, A Little History of the World. As we go through this part, listen for the following. You should be able to identify the great powers of Europe, explain how industrialization, imperialism, nationalism, and militarism are related, ideally by drawing a concept map. Explain how great power competition and militarism are related. And for a challenge, see if you can figure out how each of the concepts in red led to World War I. And again, this is written from the perspective of an author who was a man from the 1930s, not me. So, he begins. And now we are coming to the time when my parents were young. They were able to tell me exactly what things were like, how more and more homes came to have first gas and then electric lighting, and then a telephone, while in the towns electric tramways appeared, soon to be followed by cars. How vast suburbs spread to house the workers in factories with powerful machines kept thousands busy doing work which used to be done by perhaps hundreds of thousands of artisans. But whatever happened to all those textiles, shoes, tins of foods, and pots and pans that were turned out every day in wagon loads by these great factories? A certain amount, of course, could be sold at home. People who had jobs could soon afford many more clothes and shoes than artisans used to own. And everything was infinitely cheaper. even if it didn't last as long, so people had to keep buying replacements. But of course, they didn't earn enough to buy all the things the monstrous new machines produced. And if all those wagon loads of cloth and leather just sat around unsold, it was pointless for the factory to keep on producing more. It had to close down. But if it did, the workers lost their jobs and they were no longer able to buy anything, and even less was sold. This sort of situation is called an economic crisis. And to make sure it didn't happen, every country needed to sell as much as it possibly could of what its many factories produced. If it was unsuccessful at home, it had to try to sell goods abroad. Not only in Europe, where there were factories just about everywhere, but in countries where there weren't any factories. Countries where there were people who didn't yet have clothes or shoes. Factory-produced clothes or shoes, of course. In Africa, for example. And so, all of a sudden, the industrialized countries found themselves falling over each other in a race to get to remote and wild places. The wilder they were, the better. They needed them not only so they could sell their goods, but also because those places often had things that their own countries didn't have, such as cotton for making cloth and oil for petrol. But there again, the more of these so-called raw materials they brought from the colonies to Europe, the more the factories were able to produce, and the more eager was their search for places where there were still people who would buy their vast output. People who were unable to find work in their own countries could now emigrate to these foreign places. In short, it became vitally important for the countries of Europe to own colonies. Pause here and draw how industrialization, markets, raw materials, and imperialism are related to each other and depend on each other. No one bothered to ask the native inhabitants what they thought about it, and, as you can imagine, they were often very badly treated if any of them tried shooting at the invading troops with their bows and arrows. Of course, the British did best in this division of the world. After all, they had possessions in India, Australia, and North America for several centuries, and colonies in Africa, where their influence in Egypt was particularly strong. The French had also started early, and by now they owned a large part of Indochina, now known as Vietnam, and several parts of Africa, among them the Sahara Desert, more impressive perhaps on account of its size than for any other reason. The Russians had no colonies overseas, but their own empire was vast, and they didn't yet have many factories. They wanted to extend their grasp across Asia as far as the sea and trade from there. But their way was barred by those good students of the Europeans, the Japanese, who said stop. In a dreadful war that broke out between Russia and Japan in 1905, the Tsar's mighty empire was defeated and forced to give up some of its territory by tiny, new Japan. And now the Japanese also began building more and more new factories for themselves, and they too needed foreign lands, not only to sell their goods, but because there wasn't enough room for them in all their tiny island kingdom. Naturally enough, last in line for the share-out were the new states, Italy and Germany. While they had been fragmented, they had been in no position to conquer lands overseas. Now they wanted to make up for centuries of lost opportunities. After much fighting, Italy obtained some narrow strips of land in Africa. Germany was stronger and had more factories, so its needs were greater. And in time, Bismarck succeeded in acquiring several larger stretches of land for Germany, mainly in Africa, together with some islands in the Pacific. But because of the way the whole thing works, you can never have enough land. More colonies means more factories. More factories means more goods. And more goods means that even more colonies are needed. The demand isn't driven by ambition or the lust for power, but by a genuine need. But now the world had been shared out. To create new colonies, or merely to prevent the old ones from being snatched from them by stronger neighbors, it was necessary to fight, or at least threaten to do so. So each state raised powerful armies and navies and kept on saying, "Attack me if you dare." The countries that had been powerful for centuries felt they had a right to be so. But when the new German Empire and its excellent factories entered the game, built a great navy, and tried to win more and more influence in Asia and Africa, the others took it very badly. And because everyone knew that sooner or later there was bound to be a fearful conflict, they all went on expanding their armies and building bigger and bigger battleships. When war finally did break out, however, it wasn't where it had been expected all those years, nor was it on account of some dispute in Africa or Asia. It was caused by another country, the only great state in Europe to have no colonies at all, Austria. That ancient empire, with its mosaic of peoples, wasn't interested in conquering far-off lands on the other side of the world, but it did need people to buy goods made in its factories. So, just as it had done since the wars with Turkey, Austria kept on trying to acquire new lands towards the east, lands only recently liberated from Turkish rule, where there weren't yet any factories. These small populations of newly liberated eastern peoples, such as the Serbs, were frightened of the great empire and didn't want it to reach out any further. When, in the spring of 1914, the heir to the Austrian throne was visiting one of these newly conquered regions called Bosnia, he was murdered by a Serb in the capital, Sarajevo. Austria's generals and politicians thought at the time that a war with Serbia was inevitable. The dreadful murder had to be avenged, and Serbia humbled. Frightened by Austria's advance, Russia was drawn in, whereupon Germany, as Austria's ally, also became involved. And once Germany was in the war, all the ancient enmities were unleashed. The Germans wanted to begin by destroying France, their most dangerous enemy, so they marched straight across neutral Belgium to attack Paris, the capital of France. Britain, fearing that a German victory would make Germany all-powerful, now joined in as well. Soon, the whole world was at war with Germany and Austria, and the two countries found themselves surrounded by the armies of the Entente, meaning their allied enemies, those who had an understanding with one another. Germany and Austria, in the middle, were known as the Central Powers, because they were in the middle. I'll pause here and answer these questions. The gigantic Russian armies pressed forward, but they were brought to a standstill after a few months, right where the arrow is pointing in what became known as the Eastern Front, from Germany's perspective. The world has never seen a war like it. Millions and millions of people marched against each other. Even Africans and Indians had to fight as part of the colonies. The German armies were stopped when they reached the River Marne as they headed west into France, not very far from Paris. From this moment on, real battles in the old sense would only rarely be fought. What that means is, battles used to be about advancing and gaining ground and then claiming it from your enemy. But as the Germans got west, they were stopped along this line, and both sides were basically stuck there in what became known as the Western Front for about 4 years. Instead, giant armies dug themselves in and made their camps in endlessly long trenches, facing one another. Then, for days on end, they fired thousands of guns at each other, bursting out in assaults through barricades of barbed wire and blown-up trenches, across a scorched and devastated wasteland strewn with corpses. Again, most of these pictures, the most iconic pictures, are from the Western Front, which would have been here in the battle in France. In 1915, 1 year after the war started, Italy also declared war on Austria, despite having originally been its ally. Now people fought in the snow and ice of the mountains of the Tyrol, and the famous exploits of Hannibal's warriors during the crossing of the Alps seemed like child's play compared with the courage and endurance shown by these simple soldiers. People fought each other in the skies in airplanes. They dropped bombs on peaceful towns, sank innocent ships, and fought on the sea and under the sea in submarines, just as Leonardo da Vinci had foreseen. People invented horrible weapons that murdered and mutilated thousands each day, the most terrible of which were gases that poisoned the air. Anyone who breathed them died in terrible agony. These gases were either released and carried on the enemy's soldiers on the wind. These gases were either released and carried to the enemy's soldiers on the wind, or fired in the form of grenades, which released their poison when they exploded. People built armored cars and tanks which moved slowly and inexorably over ditches and walls, demolishing and crushing everything in their path. The people of Germany and Austria were destitute, hungry. For a long time, there was hardly anything to eat. No clothes, no coal, and no light. Women had to queue for hours in the cold to buy the smallest piece of bread or a half-rotten potato. But just once, there was a glimmer of hope. In Russia, a revolution had broken out in 1917, 3 years into the war. The Tsar abdicated, or gave up his throne, but the bourgeois government which followed wanted to continue with the war. However, the people were against it, so there was a second great uprising in which the factory workers, under the guidance of their leader, Lenin, seized power. They shared out the farmland among the peasants, confiscated the property of the rich and the nobility, and tried to rule the empire according to the principles of Karl Marx, so communist. Then the outside capitalist world intervened, and in the fearful battles that followed, millions more people died. Lenin's successors continued to rule Russia for many years, as the Soviet Union. The Germans were able to recall some of their troops from the Eastern Front after the Russian Revolution, but this didn't help them much because new, fresh soldiers now attacked them from the West, over this way. The Americans had decided to step in. Nevertheless, the Germans and Austrians held out for more than a year against overwhelming odds. By putting all their efforts into a last desperate attempt at the West, they very nearly won. In the end, however, they were exhausted. And when, in 1918, America's President Wilson announced he wanted a just peace, in which each nation would determine its own fate, many of their troops gave up. So Germany and Austria were forced to agree to a ceasefire. Those who had survived returned home to their starving families. The next thing that happened was that revolution broke out in these exhausted countries of Germany and Austria. The emperors of Germany and Austria abdicated, so left their thrones, and the various peoples of the Austrian Empire, the Czechs and the Slovaks, the Hungarians, the Poles, and the Southern Slavs, declared themselves independent and founded individual states. Then, having understood from President Wilson that there was to be a peace treaty, and that negotiations were to be held in the ancient royal palaces of Versailles, Saint-Germain, and Trianon, Austria, Hungary, and Germany sent envoys to Paris to these discussions, only to discover that they were excluded from the peace negotiations. Germany was held chiefly responsible for the war and was to be punished. Not only did the Germans have to surrender all the colonies and lands which they had taken from France in 1870, and pay vast sums of money to the victors each year, but they had to sign a formal declaration saying that Germany alone was to blame for the war. The Austrians and the Hungarians fared little better. So this was how President Wilson kept his promises. And here the author adds a note. He writes, "What you have just read is what I believed to be true when I wrote this account. But read my explanation in the final chapter of this book." The author was 9 years old when World War I ended, and this book was written in 1935 in Vienna, Austria, when the author was 26. So he's saying that his perspective on the end of war in 1935 was what you just read, and that it changed over time. And as we get to the next chapter, we'll see how it changed. He continues, 11 million people died in that war, and entire regions were devastated in a way that had never been seen before. The suffering was beyond imagination. Pause here and write, how did nationalism, imperialism, militarism, or great power competition shape World War I?